1.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining the call to discuss the straw proposal. This is for the Capacity Procurement Mechanism Soft Offer Cap Initiative. My name is Christina Osborne from Stakeholder Affairs. I'll be facilitating the call. We also have Gabe Murtaugh here from the Infrastructure and Policy, Regulatory Policy Development Group, and we have some others in the room. I'll go ahead and have them introduce themselves real quickly.
Anthony Ivankovich.
Greg Cook.
Rachel Lucas.
John Gooden.
Vicky Day.
Thank you, everyone. So this is the agenda for today. As you can see, we have it going till 10:35, so we don't think we're going to go till noon. We're going to talk about Gabe's going to provide an overview of the straw proposal. He's going to provide some background on backstop procurement, talk about the soft offer cap, and then compensation for the 12-month CPM, and also the bids above the soft offer cap. And then I'll go ahead and finish up with the next steps. So we are in the straw proposal phase of the stakeholder process, and then depending on the input received, we'll determine when we're going to put out the next iteration. We are looking at September for putting out the proposal, followed by a stakeholder meeting, and then we are targeting to take this to the ISO Board of Governors spring 2020. So we are going to be recording the call today. We're going to make that recording available on the initiative webpage, which is located on the Stakeholder Processes page under the Stay Informed tab on our ISO's website. That's also where you'll find the presentation as well as the straw proposal. So what we'll do is we'll kind of go through the presentation and take breaks, see if you have any questions or comments. And if you do have a question, you can enter the queue by pressing #2. Please start by introducing yourself, please. Thank you. So with that, I'll turn it over to Gabe.
Thank you for that introduction, Christina. I appreciate it. Welcome and good morning, everyone, to the call on the soft offer cap straw proposal. We're here today, and as Christina outlined, I'll just go over an overview, high level of what the ISO does for backstop procurement today, and then we'll get into the issues that we're talking about here in this policy and that we're planning to address in the proposal. So to start with, just as background again for the tools that the ISO has for backstop procurement, sort of one of the tools that we have is called the Reliability Must-Run mechanism, or an RMR mechanism. And the RMR mechanism is what the ISO uses to backstop for resources that are retiring from the system. In that first bullet, I've noted that this is what the ISO has filed, because this is what we filed in our RMR CPM Enhancements Initiative, another initiative that went to the ISO Board of Governors in March and was filed shortly thereafter at FERC, and that we're still waiting on a final ruling or order from FERC on. But that filing did say it was sort of a holistic look at the ISO's backstop tools, and it did go into details on when the ISO would use RMR and when it would use CPM, and the clarification there was that RMR would be used primarily for resources that wanted to retire from the ISO, but the ISO felt like it needed for reliability purposes. In order to get an RMR, and again, this was something that was clarified in the RMR CPM Enhancements Initiative, but if a resource wanted to receive an RMR designation, they would have to, or they'd be required to, submit a notice to the ISO to retire or mothball from the ISO system. And the idea would be that during that time the ISO was reviewing the notice to retire or mothball, we would also do a study that determines the need for the resource. If there was a reliability need that was determined by the ISO, then we would go ahead and make an RMR designation. RMR designations do come with full cost of service compensation that covers all of the operating costs for the resource, the fixed costs and the variable costs, but it only covers those costs. They don't get additional revenues in addition to that full cost of service compensation. Full cost of service compensation can be used to mitigate market power. So obviously, if the resource did have some kind of market power in the capacity construct, they wouldn't be able to exert that essentially, because they knew that they were a needed reliability resource, extract some potentially very high prices to the capacity market. This is a set price, and it matches, again, their full cost of service. Resources that are extended RMR designations are required to bid into the market at 24/7, so all intervals of the day, and they're also required to bid in at actual marginal costs. And we did clarify in RMR CPM enhancements that those marginal costs would include adders for opportunity costs, if those were applicable, and major maintenance adders. So we really are looking at a full, accurate depiction of how those marginal costs work for the resource, and making sure that that's entered into the market, and they're being dispatched based on what that total marginal cost really is. RMR resources aren't allowed to recover market revenues. This is different from CPM designations that are allowed to recover market revenues. Essentially, if there are any market revenues that are earned above those marginal costs, those are clawed back by the ISO through the settlements process that we have. And then finally, designations are mandatory. The reason that designations are mandatory is that if this resource really is retiring and the ISO really does discover that this specific resource is needed for reliability need, we need to have the authority to say, yes, we need you to stay on the system, and while the resource is on the system, they're compensated as its full cost of service, and they're required to bid in and participate in the markets. And generally, RMR resources can be made during any time of the year, but they're also designated towards the end of the year for the upcoming calendar year as well. So that's sort of the RMR tool and the one type of backstop that the ISO has. The ISO also has a tool called the Capacity Procurement Mechanism, or the CPM mechanism. And CPM is used to backstop. The flavor here is a little bit different. It's not used to necessarily backstop resources that are retiring. This tool is used to backstop resources when there are shortfalls in the RA program. So the ISO would only procure CPM after a cure period when it's making annual designations or monthly designations during the monthly RA process. The compensation here is also a little bit different than RMR. Compensation is competitive cost compensation, and it does include, as I've mentioned already, market revenues. So bids for CPM are received through the competitive solicitation process, or the CSP. So the idea here is that if the ISO is going to go out and it's going to make a CPM designation, that there could be multiple resources that are sort of competing to get that designation from the ISO. Essentially, that'll, the competition will drive down prices in the competitive solicitation process. The prices we would expect to see would likely be some function of the resources going forward fixed costs. So obviously, if a resource is going to be required to bid in the market, which does come with a CPM designation, then they're going to need to have some sort of compensation for their fixed costs. And it's also likely to include returns that they're expected to earn in the market, so market revenues would be included in there as well. And as a resource would include market revenues, the idea that the ISO expects would happen is that higher expected market revenues would mean lower requirements through the CSP and the CPM designation process. Of course, there's also market risk. Obviously, not all years are the same, so some years have high hydro years, meaning relatively low prices. Some years have higher loads or lower loads also, which could be reflected in prices, and ultimately in the kind of expected market revenues that resources can have. So risk can play a factor into what we believe would go into a competitive bid for CPMs. Then, of course, there's other factors as well. Resources may need additional money for capital additions on the resource. They may need a rate of return, and we expect them to price that in. Then, of course, as I've already mentioned, the market rents. So ideally, you've got a bunch of different resources that all have different makeups of these going forward fixed costs, market rents, expected risk in the market, those kind of things, and they're all bidding in. So you sort of get a competitive outcome when there's a lot of competition, and then the ISO can go through and can pick the resource that meets the reliability need at the cheapest cost. So that's sort of the idea behind the competitive solicitation process. And then, as we noted, of course, part of the CPM compensation is that the resources that receive designations do recover market revenues, so that they can effectively factor this in when they're bidding into the competitive solicitation process before an ISO designation. So those really are accounted for in the total compensation as well. Resources could be procured for system needs, for flex needs, or for local needs. And they have bidding requirements, and there's competitive solicitation processes for each of these products. They also could be bidding into monthly designations, or intra-monthly designations, or for annual designations. So there's a lot of different flavors for CPM, and there's different tools that the ISO uses to solicit bids for those different products. Also, if you do take your resource and you bid into the competitive solicitation process and you are awarded a CPM designation by the ISO, those designations are mandatory. So this isn't something that a resource can opt out of. Other resources may not bid into, they may not be awarded an RA designation, they may not have an RMR or a CPM designation. That sort of residual capacity that's not bid into the CSP is taken into account by the ISO in making designations, because those resources could potentially be used to meet that backstop for the RA program if the ISO needs it. And those resources and that capacity is bid in at just above the soft offer cap. And if those resources are awarded designations, they're awarded designations at the soft offer cap price. The final bullet on this slide just outlines that by and large, we do have systems and processes that govern the CPM tool, but by and large, they're not administratively burdensome for the ISO to oversee. If we get bids in the competitive solicitation process and the ISO does make a CPM designation, that designation or that award price is struck at the bid in the competitive solicitation process. And that becomes the capacity payment that the ISO makes to that resource. That resource still, and that does come with bidding obligations, as I've mentioned. But by and large, those bidding obligations are the same that are used in the RA program. And then also that outside of the capacity payment, the resource is also treated the same as other RA resources and other resources that are bidding into the market. So they're allowed to bid into the market. The ISO still calculates default energy bids for these resources. These resources are eligible for bid cost recovery, but by and large they work primarily the same way that other RA resources do. So to oversee and to administer this program, it's relatively easy and straightforward to make those CPM designations. RMR designations are a little bit more difficult. They have to, all of the full cost of service does need to be reviewed, and it is reviewed by FERC, which is not the case with the CPM designation. So I just want to make that note as we go through this process, and that does tie into some of the changes that we're talking about for the CPM designations later on in the proposal. So on slide 7, we talk about CPM designations having a soft offer cap, which is one of the ways that market power could potentially be mitigated. So essentially, if I am a single resource and I know that I'm needed by the ISO and I know that I don't have an RA designation, it's not possible for a resource to extract as much money from the ISO to get that CPM designation as possible. It's limited by the soft offer cap. So any resource bidding into the CSP or the competitive solicitation process may bid in up to the soft offer cap, which is currently $6.31 per kW a month. And these bids aren't reviewed by the ISO. They're not subject to any further scrutiny. And the idea is that the soft offer cap is set in such a way that we think that it's going to cover most, if not all, resources that the ISO would be making these CPM designations to. So if we're making a designation at that price, and again, we're assuming if this market, the competitive solicitation process is competitive, we're coming up with a competitive outcome, and those are the designations that are made. Eligible capacity that does not bid into the competitive solicitation process will automatically have bids inserted just above the soft offer cap, which is what I talked about on the last slide. But again, those designations are made, if they are made to those resources, they're made at the soft offer cap. And then resources are allowed to submit bids above the soft offer cap, but again, these bids must be cost justified at FERC, and they are based, the current tariff language says that they're based on cost of service. This is another thing that we suggested changes to in the RMR CPM Enhancements Initiative, and the changes that we suggested there, we are rolling into this proposal, and those changes will be filed at FERC at the same time as the changes that we have for the remainder of the policy here in this proposal. And we'll get into that a little bit later in the discussion here of this proposal. So also, just as background to how the soft offer cap was initially constructed, it was set initially using going forward fixed costs for a new large gas-fired combined cycle resource with duct firing. The going forward fixed cost was used, and just as a reminder to folks on the line here, it includes components of fixed costs that were included in the CEC's cost of new entry study, and that included the going forward fixed costs are insurance costs, ad valorem costs, and fixed operation maintenance costs, and those are sort of all fixed components. But the going forward fixed costs do not include other components, including the capital and financing costs and the taxes, which are also broken out in that CEC report. So, again, further background on soft offer cap. It was initially set in a stakeholder process that happened about 4 years ago, and it was the rules that were set up in that process that triggered this initiative and this review of the current existing soft offer cap. So the ISO used values, as I've said, from the 2014 Cost of New Generation report that was published by the CEC to formulate the soft offer cap. Just as a little bit of background here, the Cost of New Generation report is something that's periodically updated by the CEC, and the 2014 report was not the first version of this. This had been updated from a prior version. But it did include cost of new generation for a variety of different resources, and generally it's resources that are typical on the California ISO system. When the policy was implemented, it did include specific tariff obligations to at least review the soft offer cap every 4 years, and the idea would be that as the CEC was publishing new and updated versions of the cost of new generation report, if there were large changes that were outlined in that report, perhaps because of something that was happening in California ISO market conditions, that the soft offer cap would be updated accordingly. To that end, the CEC did update their study in May of this year, and that's sort of what triggered the kickoff for this initiative for the review of the soft offer cap. In addition to just focusing on the soft offer cap for the CPM competitive procurement mechanism, or capacity procurement mechanism, FERC has also asked the ISO to avoid piecemeal filings when we're going to make changes to tariff and to ISO market mechanisms. In an effort to comply with FERC's requests, what we've done is we're not only looking at the soft offer cap and the values or the review of the soft offer cap in this initiative, but we're also looking at compensation and competitiveness for 12-month designations within this initiative. And the reason we're looking at that is that was a topic that we got a fair amount of feedback on in the previous initiative, in that RMR CPM Enhancements Initiative. We also got feedback and comments on it and some concern from stakeholders in the issue paper for this initiative, and we feel like it's appropriate to address at this time. So we're sort of taking a holistic look at CPM and making sure that we're including everything there. And then finally, as I alluded to already, there was an RMR CPM enhancement initiative issue that included bids above the soft offer cap, and we are including the tariff language that we've sort of implied from that initiative in this filing as well. And then there could also be some other potential CPM-related items just to sort of round out the topic here. So that's sort of what I had for background on the ISO's tools that it has for backstop. I think we can take any questions now before we dive into the policy proposal for this initiative. But I will just take back the questions on the background and not necessarily on the policy that we've proposed in the straw proposal. We'll be going through that in the next few slides, and we can take questions on that as we go through each part of the proposal.
So if you do have a question, you can press #2 to raise your hand. Lindy, let me know if anybody enters the queue.
At this time, there are no questions in queue. Once again, please dial #2 if you would like to ask a question. We do have a question in queue. The caller line is now open.
Gabe, this is Stephen Kelly with IEV. Thanks very much for the presentation. And I have one quick question. Is the ISO seeing an increase in the incidence of CPM designations this year or even the last 2 years compared to previous years, and if so, by how much? Thanks.
Hey, Stephen, good morning. Yeah, I don't know that I have, I assume you're thinking about exceptional dispatch designations. I don't have those numbers in front of me directly, but I could certainly follow up with you. I will say we are focusing a lot of the proposal on annual designations. There were 2, of course, annual CPM designations made in 2018 for the Encina and the Moss Landing units for quite a few megawatts, and which did accrue considerable expense. We haven't seen any designations for 2019, so there's been no annual designations made for this year. But if you want to get into details about exceptional dispatch or monthly designations, I need to pull the numbers, but I could follow up with you offline on that.
Great, thank you. I think that would be helpful to know just kind of the scope and scale of the CPM designation program, just generally.
Yeah, sure. I could pull something together for you on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Any other questions, Lindy?
At this time, there are no further questions.
Okay. All right, so as we've noted sort of in the outline of this presentation, we've got 3 major pieces of policy that we're making proposals on here, and in fact, one of those pieces is something that we teed up in the RMR CPM Enhancements Initiative as that 3rd piece. But those 3 pieces are, first of all, examining, just having a review of the soft offer cap and taking a look at the $75.67 per kW year, or $6.31 per kW month. And we'll go through that. And then the second proposal that we're going to make in this piece of policy is implementing a 3 pivotal supplier test for only annual CPM designations. And then if, depending on the results of that 3 pivotal supplier test, the ISO would, if there's a failure in that test, the ISO would use sort of a more cost of service, full cost of service compensation paradigm. If the test passed, we would still stick with the current competitive solicitation process that we have and CPM designation process that we have today. And then finally, I will talk about what was discussed in the RMR CPM Enhancements Initiative for bids above the soft offer cap, but we're not really planning to make any changes there to that piece. So it's more of a review of what we talked about in that initiative and what the ISO is planning to file. I will go through each of these pieces of the proposal And after each of the parts, I'll just allow time for questions again. And then finally, Christina will wrap up, and then if we have any final questions, we can address them there. In addition to simply reviewing the soft offer cap, we also got several questions and comments from stakeholders that suggested potential reviews of the soft offer cap formulation, and along with that, it's also thinking about the methodological approach to how we're thinking about CPM and how CPM compensation really should work. I think we're sensitive to those comments, and I think in future iterations, so obviously, as I mentioned, the tariff requires the ISO to evaluate or at least review the soft offer cap every 4 years. So we will be doing this again, and in the future as we go forward, I think we will be seriously looking at how the soft offer cap is formulated currently and what the CPM soft offer cap is meant to represent and do in terms of our CPM tools. But I don't know that we're going to be moving forward on any big changes to the CPM paradigm at this time. So the CPM soft offer cap, as we've discussed, is sort of assuming that going forward fixed costs for relatively new mid-cost combined cycle gas resource is a likely a high end for a price that for any resource that the ISO would retain through the CPM process. And the idea, again, is that that soft offer cap set by that resource would be sufficiently high to cover most, if not all, resources that the ISO would be extending CPM designations to, and therefore, if there is competition and the competitive outcome is to make a designation for a resource at less than that soft offer cap, then that would likely be fine, and the ISO should go ahead and make that designation. It's not clear if in the future a combined cycle resource, gas-fired particularly combined cycle resource, would necessarily be the marginal resource on the ISO system and may necessarily be the resource that the ISO would be making CPM designations to in the future. A lot of gas-fired generation on the California system today is there's a lot of retirements planned in the near future, and a lot of the planning around those retirements generally involves storage resources or batteries being put on the system to replace that gas-fired generation. So we do anticipate that in the future, the ISO may be making designations not to gas-fired generation, but to potentially storage resources. And if so, storage resources may have a very different cost structure, or they do have a very different cost structure than combined cycle gas resources. So it may make sense to include those in future analysis. I will note, though, that there's currently few of these resources on the system today. While we do have a large amount of these storage resources in the interconnection queue today, they're not currently on the system. Currently, we have about 150 megawatts of installed capacity. But in the future, there could be a lot more. So we should continue to think about this, and we should continue to think about this in future iterations of this review of soft offer cap as we go forward. The final note on storage resources is that they were not included in the 2018 CEC study or report that they published. We have been in contact with the CEC and the folks, specifically the folks who are writing the new reports. We've asked, first and foremost, that they continue writing these reports, as they are sort of a critical piece of information that we use in informing the soft offer cap. But secondly, we've also asked that as the system evolves and there's new resources on the system, they do include those costs associated with those new technology types in their studies in the future, so that we may be able to use some of that information when informing our soft offer cap in the future. We also received several comments from stakeholders asking for consideration of cost of new entry or the cone to determine the soft offer cap. Currently, we don't think, and of course we're willing to continue discussions on this, but currently we don't think that this is necessarily appropriate. We see the CPM tool as, again, it's the ISO's tool to backstop for RA shortfalls. So if there's already an existing resource on the system that the ISO needs for reliability, but for whatever reason it wasn't picked up in the RA market, the tool that the ISO has to procure that resource is the CPM. And, you know, in the Eastern markets, I think cost of new entry is really used as an incentive for some mechanisms to sort of incentivize new build. So it represents sort of what is the cost of a new build for a resource in the system. And the ISO here in California, with the CPM tool specifically, we're not really doing that. We're just saying if there is an existing resource, how much do we need to give them to make sure that they're going to be able to cover their full fixed costs? And sort of the number that we've come up with for that is the going forward fixed cost. And of course we acknowledge that there may be other things that go into their calculation for what they need, and that could include, you know, market revenues, rates of return, those sort of things. But the major component there is the going forward fixed costs, and we want to make sure that those are covered in the CPM tool. So that's sort of where we are with that. But we do appreciate the feedback, and we are willing to continue the conversation about CPM and how this soft offer cap is used and how it's and what sort of numbers inform that value. So we're on slide 9 now, and the first proposal that we make is to retain the existing $6.31 per kW month soft offer cap, given the values that we've seen in the current 2018 CEC report. And we also feel like, you know, the updated values from the 2014 report really don't justify a change to soft offer cap that we have currently in place. So as I've mentioned, the ISO is using going forward fixed costs for combined cycle resource plus a 20% adder to initially calculate soft offer cap. And 4 years ago, when we initially put this in place, we used the values from the 2014 CEC study for the cost of new generation. The 2014 report kind of came up with our initial 75.67 per kW year, which is a value of $6.31 per kW month. And then we can sort of use the same report from 2018 that the CEC published, and the same comparable values that they had there would imply, using the same formula, a $70.67 per kW a year soft offer cap. So that's a change of course, about $5 per kW a year, or about 7% of the total. So overall, not a terribly large change from the 2014 report to the 2018 report, but there was one other critical change that happened between those two reports, and instead of using a 550 megawatt combined cycle resource, the representative resource changed to a 700 megawatt combined cycle resource, and the 550 megawatt wasn't included in the new 2018 report at all. Again, like I said, we've had some conversations with the folks who are putting together the report of the CEC, and they said that the largest impact to that dollar amount from the $75 to the $70 or $76 to $71 per kW year change came from the fact that they changed from a 550 megawatt combined cycle resource to a 700 megawatt combined cycle resource. So the idea there is that, well, you've got some fixed costs, and when you spread those fixed costs out over a larger number of megawatts, the total amount that you need for capacity payments on a per megawatt or per kilowatt value sort of gets spread out a little bit more and actually lowers the cost. So that sort of was the primary driver to the change that they had. Of course, this wasn't the only driver in the new updated CEC report. We outlined a few of those different changes in the hard copy of the straw proposal, but they did have smaller impacts. And a note about the 700 megawatt combined cycle resource. Of course, you know, we're not seeing 700 megawatt resources being built in the California market. So it's not likely that we'd be extending new CPM designation to a 700 megawatt resource, where in the past we'd be extending a designation to a 500 megawatt combined cycle resource. We think by and large the resources that we would be making designations to haven't changed. So keeping that $6.31 per kW a month price seems reasonable in this case. So at this point, we can open up the phone lines and see if we have any questions on that piece of the proposal before we go on.
Sure, again, you can raise your hand by pressing pound 2. And you can let me know if anybody enters a queue.
Yes, and we do have one question in queue. And caller, your line is now open.
Morning, Gabe. This is Todd Ryan from PG&E. So the intent is that you're not changing the reference resource, correct?
So the intent is that we're not adjusting the soft offer cap from the previously calculated version of $6.31 per kW month.
Okay, but you're trying to, by not strictly following the methods previously used and reducing the soft offer cap to $5.89 per kilowatt month, you're essentially trying to correct for the economies of scale between the 550 megawatt and the 700 megawatt resource?
Well, frankly, the tariff obligates the ISO to review the soft offer cap and sort of ensure its reasonability. Is it still a reasonable number for soft offer cap, for the construct, for what we need it for, and is it still accomplishing the goals that we set out for it to do? It's not necessarily to go in and to redo our calculations and to justify why we did a calculation one way or another way. It really is to say, is the soft offer cap you're using still reasonable? Does it need to be updated? It does allow for the ISO to use the CEC report and take those numbers and plug them directly in, and without too much more burden on the ISO, but it doesn't necessarily say, hey, do a calculation and justify why you're going to pick one number or another number. The idea here and the objective is really to make sure that we have a number that accurately reflects what we think the soft offer cap should be, and the ISO's position is that the $6.31 that we've had in place still does that, and I think that's reasonably justified by the values that we see in the CEC report as well.
So the economy of scale that you mentioned between the 550 megawatt and 700 megawatt, if you look at the effects of the economy of scale on the fixed cost, going forward fixed cost components, doesn't justify the elimination of the 6.5%. So what I'm hearing is that you don't really have a process, and you guys just have discretion to take a swag at it.
Yeah, this is Greg Cook. I'll weigh in here. I don't think I wouldn't put it that way. You know, we have reviewed it. We've reviewed the costs that came out of the CEC. You know, furthermore, all indications are that RA costs are going up, not down. So that, in our view, didn't justify lowering the cap either. So, you know, given all of that information taken together, we thought the best proposal at this point was to leave the cap where it is today. We haven't had any information provided. Costs are actually going down for resource adequacy.
One final question, which is that you mentioned a couple times today on the phone or on the call that expected market revenues is a driver of resources going forward fixed cost. And I'm hoping you can point to where you're taking that into account when setting the soft offer cap.
Yeah, so the methodology that we've used to set the soft offer cap really does just focus on going forward fixed costs. I've been alluding to the fact that if there is competition in the competitive solicitation process, likely a primary driver in any bids in the competitive solicitation process would be based off of going forward fixed costs, and that'd be the majority of what we'd expect to be bid in there. But we also know that that's not the only component of costs that resources could have that the ISO could potentially procure for CPM. So the idea is that, well, if you do have these resources and they are bidding into the CSP, what are they bidding? Well, I think going forward fixed cost is a good proxy for that, but they might also be considering, potential rate of return. They could be they certainly would be including, potential risk in the market and the risk that comes with, having a 24/7 must offer obligation, potential risk for RAIM exposure, which these resources would be subject to, and then they would also, I think, would also consider, well, hey, if I can make a lot of money through market revenues, I probably would bid a little bit less in the competitive solicitation process. If I know that market revenues are going to be kind of thin for the specific location where my resource is, that might cause them to bid a little bit higher than another resource.
So,
if that makes sense.
It does, but what I'm hearing you say is that the CSPs are sufficiently competitive that we don't need to take into account expected market revenues in our soft offer cap. Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, that might be an avenue that we consider going down, and if we do consider going down that avenue, I think the ISO's current position is that, well, and this is when we initially set the soft offer cap, going forward fixed cost is a pretty good proxy for what we think bids are. Of course, there's other things that we think are going to be included in those bids, and in the future, we may consider including other factors when we set the soft offer cap. But today, we think that $6.31 is fairly representative of where the soft offer cap should be, and in the future, we may reevaluate that.
Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. Thanks for the question, Todd.
Any other questions, Wendy?
Yes, and we do have another question in queue. And caller, your line is now open.
Hi, Dave Francis, DT Energy Trading. If the ISO was 100% convinced that several months had RA prices that were valued at $10 a kW every month, how would that change your thoughts on what the soft offer cap should be, or how the annual total should be allocated?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, Dave. Thanks. So I think we talked a little bit about this at the bottom of slide 10, and what we're really thinking about here, or what we're trying to think about, is our soft offer cap really should be compensation for existing resources that are already on the system, because that's what we're going to be backstopping, and we need to think about what kind of compensation they need in addition to market revenues to be viable and to adequately compensate them to stay around on the system. So it's not necessarily informed by, there's other interesting things that I think RA prices could tell us, but it's not necessarily informed by what those RA prices are.
So it would be acceptable in CAISO's mind at this time?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
That you are actually forcing a price lower than the market price?
Well, again, these are resources that weren't picked up in the RA market. So this was the process that we use to make a CPM designation is, and again, this is what was proposed in the RMR CPM enhancements. This is still at FERC. But the idea is that, okay, if there's a shortfall in RA procurements, the ISOs offered a cure period and no resources had been procured, then the ISO would go back through and make CPM designations. And of course, I think we should also just call out that for local, which is where a lot of these designations are made generally, the new RA construct from the CPUC is requiring 100% of local targets be procured, not just 1 year out, but 1 year out and 2 years out, and then 50% of those requirements procured 3 years out. So we really do expect that these resources are picked up through the RA process, regardless of what those prices are. And then in the event that they're not, the ISO still needs a tool to be able to backstop for these resources. And that's the CPM. Yeah.
No, I appreciate that. It just bears noting that the $75 is essentially 1/30th of the cost, and the $631 or whatever is 1/360th of it. So the idea that, you know, it's an average of an average, the idea that 1 or 2 months is adequate compensation for a 30-year investment just rings fairly hollow to me. But appreciate the answers.
Thank you, Dave. And I think one other thing that we could consider is that, and it's not certainly going to go to, you know, the full cost of new entry, but the reference resource that we used from the CEC study was a mid-cost resource, and perhaps it might be reasonable to consider a high-cost resource when calculating the soft offer cap in the future. Again, that's another thing that could change as we move forward and iterate on this particular initiative, which would come up every 4 years. But I appreciate the comments, and thank you for the feedback.
Yep, thanks, Seth.
Any other questions, Lindy?
Yes, so we do have another question in queue. And caller, your line is now open.
Gabe, this is Carrie Bentley from the Western Power Trading Forum. I had a question as to kind of the intent of the soft offer cap, given your proposal to implement a 3 pivotal supplier test. I mean, the original intent was to have a market-based backstop, and FERC had said that, you know, average cost plus 10% wasn't enough, and that you really need to give people room to bid, but not too much room to exert market power. But if you're proposing a market power test, it seems to me that then this kind of methodology would no longer be appropriate. So I was wondering if you could kind of describe it more holistically while you're on this slide, kind of the intent of the cap.
Yeah, thanks, Carrie. I think that's a good question, and I think it's definitely worth pointing out. And we agree with you. You know, that is an accurate portrayal of how we came up with the soft offer cap initially. The idea that we're thinking about with the 3 pivotal supplier test is specific to annual CPM designations. So it doesn't apply to monthly designations, and of course we're going to get into this part of the proposal in my next few slides. But it doesn't apply to monthly designations. It's not applying to exceptionally dispatched designations. It's not applying to other intra-monthly designations either. So, you know, the paradigm for the ISO doing a majority of its CPM is still largely intact. And the other thing I'll note is that it also doesn't apply to annual CPM designations that are made where there is sufficient or 3 pivotal suppliers, where we're going to say, you know, that's sufficient competition. So anytime the market is competitive, we'll still rely on the soft offer cap. Anytime we're making a monthly designation or we're making those intra-monthly designations, we're still relying on the soft offer cap, and nothing is changing there. The only thing we're really focusing on changing is, well, situations where we don't pass the 3 pivotal supplier test, so that means essentially that there isn't sufficient competition, so we're not going to get a necessarily competitive outcome in P, and then it's only for those annual designations.
I guess my worry, thanks for that clarification, that's really helpful, first of all.
Yep.
But my worry with that is that if you essentially say your annual designations will be at cost, then that'll push people into the backstop rather than in the procurement. I mean, you could easily see the CPUC then saying, well, if the market is over, you know, $6.31, then we're going to not procure resources. We're going to let a couple go to the CAISO. There'll only be a couple there, especially in local areas, and then you'll backstop, right, at cost. So I'm not sure how that's a market-based backstop anymore, given the interaction with the CPUC.
Yeah, I don't want to speak out of turn here, and I don't want to speak for the CPUC, but my feeling is, you know, that they take their RA requirements very seriously. And obviously we know that, you know, the CPUC is working with the ISO and the RA Enhancements Initiative to think about what requirements might look like in the future. But by and large, I think they do take their RA requirements very seriously, and they, you know, I think the CPUC has said time and time again that they don't want folks relying on, backstop procurement. They really do want this stuff procured and as a front stop in the RA process. And I think the ISO is in agreement with that. And we hope to do, less backstop, and that's sort of our mandate.
Yeah. I mean, but they've also had a local waiver price for years. It's not, right, where they've literally said if the price in a local area is too high, we will waive your obligation at the CPUC and essentially then rely just on the CAISO. I mean, I understand that you can't
maybe that's,
CPUC, but it's, to me, that's the biggest challenge of ever doing anything cost-based without really making sure that the CPUC rules are set first. And maybe that's a chicken or egg thing.
Okay. Thanks, Carrie. I think that might be worth continuing to think about. I'll take that back.
Any other questions in the queue, Lindsay?
At this time, there are no further questions in queue.
Okay. So I think I'll thank Carrie again because she did a nice job teeing up our next piece of this proposal, which is around which we just got a little preview for, which is around the 12-month designations and CPM compensations for those designations that the ISO makes. So several stakeholders have expressed concerns about 12-month designations, and again, this doesn't apply to monthly designations or intra-monthly designations. We got comments and concerns about this in the RMR CPM Enhancements Initiative, and then we also got comments and concerns about this in the issue paper that we put out for this initiative. And the concern kind of goes like this. It says, well, if there's maybe a resource in a local area and it's maybe that particular resource knows that it's needed for reliability, then it could essentially, regardless of what its actual going forward fixed costs are, if it's the only resource, it knows that it's going to be picked up by the ISO through the backstop mechanism, through the CPM mechanism, and it's going to get, if it doesn't bid anything, it'll get a $6.31 per kW a month designation. And again, without any local competition or competition in the competitive solicitation process, it really could extract rents beyond what its going forward fixed costs are, and then of course there'd be other considerations for market revenues and expected risk and that sort of thing. There's less concern among stakeholders through these two initiatives for resources receiving designations for 30 or 60-day designations. Of course, if a resource is awarded a designation, it does have a bidding obligation, it does have exposure to RAIM, it still is going to encounter those fixed costs that it takes to maintain the resource, and perhaps a 30 or 60-day designation at that $6.31 cap is a little bit more palatable because it might be spread over 12 months to cover fixed costs over that whole time period rather than a 12-month designation, which really would cover fixed costs for the entire year. And if those fixed costs were significantly less than the payments, perhaps that might not be appropriate. So if we go on to the next slide, we're on slide 13 now. The ISO is proposing, which is very much in line with some of the comments that we got, a 3 pivotal supplier test for 12-month CPM designations. So 3 pivotal supplier test looks at ownership structures for residual capacity that could be used to meet a particular backstop need. So any resource or any capacity that's already been designated for RA or for CPM or for RMR wouldn't be eligible to be considered in the 3 pivotal supplier test. Additionally, the 3 largest suppliers, so the way the test is actually calculated is that we look at all this residual capacity, we determine the 3 largest owners of the resources in that pool, and then we remove that capacity, and then we've got some capacity that's left over, and we compare that amount that's left over to the amount of the need for reliability. If the amount is greater than the need, then the condition passes the 3 pivotal supplier test. If, however, that residual capacity is less than the amount that's needed or that there aren't 3 suppliers to remove, then the test fails. So it fails the 3 pivotal supplier test. So if the three-pivotal supplier test fails, then the ISO is proposing to not use the standard competitive solicitation process and instead use full cost of service compensation, and the compensation would be very much in line with the RMR compensation today. However, if the three-pivotal supplier test passes, then we basically continue to use the competitive solicitation process, and we make 12-month CPM designations as we would normally make them at whatever price the CSP clears at, as long as the test passes. So what would a compensation look like if the ISO does make this 12-month CPM designation and the three-pivotal supplier test is failed and there's resources available to make the designation? Essentially, just like the RMR compensation, the resources would be required to file a Schedule F and a Schedule L to determine what the full cost of service for the designations would be. This compensation would include, again, this is the same compensation that we'd make for RMR resources. It would include operations and maintenance expenses. It would include depreciation expenses, return on taxable allowance, variable costs from operation. So obviously when a gas-fired resource operates, it consumes fuel, and there's a cost associated with that, so those costs are compensated. And then also necessary annualized capital addition costs. So here it wouldn't be, let's say the resource did need a cap add to operate in the year ahead time frame. We wouldn't necessarily pay the full freight for that capital addition. It would be annualized just for that, and those would be the costs that would be associated with the full cost of service CPM designation. Also, compensation would not include any market revenues above what those variable costs are for the resource. So if a resource costs really are $25 per megawatt hour and it earns $50 per megawatt hour, the ISO would go back in and claw back that additional $25 in market revenue, and that would not be compensated to the resources that get this designation. So if we go on to the next slide, this is slide 15. We sort of outlined the details about what a full cost of service CPM designation would include. And forgive me, I did put quite a bit of text on this slide. It perhaps could have been broken out into two different slides. But we sort of outlined sort of all the details that are around what a full cost of service designation would look like. So first of all, and we think this is a really important note here, is that designations for full cost of service CPM would only be extended to full resources. So when you do think about full cost of service, it really doesn't, it's not a paradigm that works with partial resources. So if you, extend, you have a 200 megawatt resource and you extend a full cost of service to just 100 megawatts of that 200 total megawatts, it's not clear that 100 megawatts needs half of the fixed costs to operate. It actually needs all the fixed costs to operate. So there's no sense in making partial designations. So we're going to designate for the full resource. But the good news is when that full designation is made, then all of the credits and the abilities for that resource will also be accounted for, and those will be required to be bid into the market. So similar to RMR, we'll have a similar cost allocation to how that works, and I've got an example of that on the slide. RMR credit for all attributes of the resource will be allocated in a similar manner to costs. So the resource could have local capabilities, it could have flex capabilities, it could have system capabilities, and if it does, then all of those attributes will be allocated accordingly to the same parties that are picking the cost for the resource. And the resource will also have a requirement to bid into the ISO market on a 24/7 basis at their variable cost, as we've discussed in the previous page. And this is similar, again, to what was proposed in the RMR CPM Enhancements Initiative, but the bids will be required to include all major maintenance adders and all opportunity cost adders. All revenue above the variable cost and major maintenance will be clawed back to prevent any kind of double recovery of those costs, so you're only eligible to recover those costs once. And then also this is a similar artifact to the proposed RMR treatment, but ancillary service and RUC bids will be bid into at $0, which is again similar to how the RMR resources are treated. These resources would be subject to RAIM, and they'd be subject to RAIM for all components that they're eligible to receive credit for. So again, if they have flex capabilities, they would be subject to flex RAIM requirements. The second to last bullet is a little bit of a nuance here that's a little bit different than RMR resources. So full cost of service CPM designations may be rejected by the resource. So it does come with this 24/7 must offer obligation, and it does come with RAIM accountability. So the resource can say, okay, I don't want to accept this offer. So it may not be accepted by the resource, which is different than the RMR tool. And then there is no requirement for these resources to file a notice to retire or to mothball with the ISO when they're awarded a full cost of service CPM designation, which again is a dissimilarity between the RMR resource and how that's proposed in our most recent initiative that's been filed with FERC. So now we'll go through on slide 16 a somewhat straightforward, hopefully straightforward example of what one of these full cost of service CPM designations would look like, and then I'll follow this topic up with just sort of the decision tree that the ISO would go through, and then we'll take questions. So here in this case, let's just suppose that there are 3 load-serving entities. Each of those load-serving entities has a requirement to show 100 megawatts in the RA space. So LSEs easily 1, 2, and 3. LSE 1 shows exactly 100 megawatts, so it meets its requirements. LSE 2 is 20 megawatts short, and it shows just 80 megawatts, and LSE 3 shows 70 megawatts. So we've got a shortage of 20 megawatts and 30 megawatts for a total shortage of 50 megawatts. So the ISO now goes out and looks for 50 megawatts. It does the 3-pipple supplier test, and let's just suppose the 3-pipple supplier test fails. And the only resource available to the ISO is a 75 megawatt resource. So clearly the 75 megawatts is larger than the 50 megawatt deficiency. So what's going to happen? So the first thing that happens in cost allocation is that 50 of the megawatts are going to be allocated to the LSEs that are short in their RA showings. So LSE 2 is short by 20 megawatts and LSE 3 is short by 30 megawatts. So the 50 megawatts that were procured sort of fill in those gaps in the RA showings and are allocated out to LSE 2 and 3, and any costs associated with that are allocated based on those ratios. Finally, there's a 25 megawatt of residual capacity that was procured through this procurement, and that just gets allocated out on a load ratio share basis or a requirement share basis to each of the 3 LSEs. So in this case, each of the LSEs had the same requirement, so the allocation is being made in the same fashion. So a third of the cost for that for the final 25 megawatts of procurement is allocated to LSEs 1, 2, and 3. And that's just meant to show a picture of how costs would be allocated. And then similarly, the backstop designation would also be accompanied by a certain amount of credit, and that could be local, flex, or system credit, and those credits will be allocated in the same way. Generally, and we note this in the paper, but generally those that credit is made in a year-ahead time frame, so we might not have all of the numbers and the cost allocation finalized in time for the month-ahead showings in January and February, so those might not kick in for the first few months of the year, depending on when the full cost of service CPM designation can be made. So if we go to the next slide, we can see just sort of a little decision tree here that outlines the process that the ISO would use to make one of these full cost of service CPM designations. Essentially, as I've noted, the CPM would determine that there's a need. Of course, there would be the same cure period that there is today in the RA process. But if that need wasn't met after the cure period, the ISO would go through and do the 3-pipple supplier test. If there was market power determined in the 3-pipple supplier test, that's sort of the area that we're considering here for a 12-month full cost of service CPM designation. If the market power 3-pipple supplier test is passed, or there is no market power, then we use the standard CSP process to make a designation. It was pointed out to me that theoretically this should sort of be the end of the line here, and I should probably have an extra arrow to go to complete from here, but we'll make that note. But if there is market power detected, the next thing the ISO would do is say, are there multiple resources available that could meet that we have to sort of plug that RA hole? If there are multiple needs, then the ISO is going to go out and ask for cost of service data from those resources because it needs some information, particularly about cost, before making any decisions on designations that would be awarded. So first thing we're going to do is try to get those costs from resources, and then from those costs we'll determine the best resources that could be used to meet the reliability needs. And then from that information, we'd be making the appropriate designation. So essentially what we'd be doing is we'd be making a designation to the least expensive resource that was available to meet the RA needs. Similar to other CPM designations, there's some tiebreaker criteria. So if there are resources that have very similar costs, then the ISO might potentially make a designation to multiple resources. There's other criteria that we could use to potentially decide which resource would be made the designation to, but the first consideration would be for cost. And then, as we mentioned, these resources aren't obligated to accept the designation that the ISO makes. So if the designation is not accepted, and there are more resources, we could sort of get into a do loop here where further designations could be extended. And again, if they're accepted or not. If they're accepted, then I think we're done with the process and we've got our backstop capacity in place and we don't need to go any further. If they're not accepted and there aren't any others, of course, we're sort of done too, and we just haven't met the requirements that we need. So that sort of outlines the process that we have for the full cost of service CPM designations. Are there any questions on that piece of the proposal?
Raise your hand by pressing pound 2.
Hey, Gabe. It's Carrie Benson from the Western Power Trading Forum again. I have a question. Actually, I have 2 questions and a comment. My first question is, let's say you do this loop and then no one's available, so you don't, the needed resource essentially turns down the designation. And then you roll into the local monthly process. Wouldn't then they just get the monthly CPM because you'd still have a shortage?
Yeah, so I think that's exactly what we might anticipate happening. So these resources may turn down a full cost of service CPM designation. The ISO still retains, they're still interconnected to the grid, so the ISO still has the ability to exceptionally dispatch them. Potentially, if there's shortfalls in monthly showings, that might be an opportunity for the ISO to procure them if they're not procured for monthly in those processes. And then finally, if there really is no other option and the ISO does need these resources and they are exceptionally dispatched by the ISO, then they're eligible to receive exceptional dispatch CPM awards.
Yeah, I guess I take your point with exceptional dispatch, but just process-wise, this runs in November, right, for the annual process, early November. But then the bids for January are due, and you do a local assessment for that as well. And so putting significant event and exceptional dispatch aside, essentially you would still have at that moment anyway the same shortage. So unless they were procured by a resource, you would still have that local deficiency month to month. Because typically, right, it doesn't change between the annual and monthly process. So then if they turn this down, one each month absent procurement from an LSE, wouldn't it be reasonable for the CAISO to say, oh, there's still a shortage, and then once they get that $6.31 number anyway?
Well, the annual process is a little bit different, right? Because you've got requirements for the entire year. So, and those requirements for the entire year include, the summer peaking months when you'd expect you'd need, the most resources, and probably that's when you're going to have gaps in reliability. So even though you've got a gap in potentially the annual process, but potentially for that peak month, you may not see the same gap in the month-ahead showings in the month-ahead process because loads may be lower. Additionally, procurement doesn't necessarily stay the same in the annual process and the monthly process. So the mix of the resources that you have in the monthly process could also change as well. So you've got differing targets and you've got differing mix of resources in both processes. So they may not necessarily be the same requirement.
They might not, but just to be clear, the local requirement is for 100% of the peak month in the entire year. So the CAISO has a requirement for LSUs to show that 100% in every single month, regardless of the technical need within the month. So if a LSC is short, or in aggregate a local area is short in January, they still should be CPMing, right? Regardless of the fact that, loads are different in January than in August. It's still a requirement.
That's an interesting point. Let me look into that a little bit more and think about that a little bit more.
Okay, thanks. Okay, and then my next point is I'm wondering if you can go back to slide 15 and just spend a couple moments explaining the rationale for this in general. I think I'm still a little bit confused, especially because this is only made for full resources, and partial is very likely. So a couple things I hope you could hit on. One, whether you ever would imagine a local residual backstop to be competitive. Because in my mind, I can't actually imagine that happening, particularly with a central buyer. And then two, your opinion on, I guess, what you're trying to achieve here, meaning, I think the whole point of a backstop and to do market power testing is to prevent resources from extracting unreasonable rents by exerting market power. So I'm curious on what the intent of this is here in terms of that reasonableness. As Dave Francis said, is comparison to the market reasonable? So if you could just elaborate a little bit, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, I think those are both really good questions. So let me take the second one first. So what are we trying to achieve here? Sort of as I noted, I think there's a lot of stakeholder concern about the potential, and a lot of this is in local areas, for resources that there aren't a whole lot of alternatives for to exercise market power and extract rent or extract going forward fixed costs up to that $6.31. In addition to market revenues, when their true going forward fixed costs might be much less than that in the 12-month period. And that's the feedback that we've heard from stakeholders, and that's sort of what's really causing us to go down this route, is it's a question of, well, in the local areas, there may not be much competition, and these resources really could get the full 631, even though their costs could be significantly less than that. And I think that this does outline a fairly concise proposal that says, well, hey, if we do get in that situation where there is, just one or two resources in a local area, how are we going to make a designation for these resources, and what should they get compensated? Well, we've heard from FERC time and time again in their rulings that full cost of service is just and reasonable, so we can make those designations for those resources. So I think your second question, yeah.
No. Can you comment on that? What I'm really trying to get at is I don't understand whether the CAISO believes a market price is reasonable or not. So, for example, the central buyer ends up procuring local resources at $7. Is it then reasonable to pay them $6.31 as a backstop? What if they procure at $6? I mean, you could look at the most recent 2018 RA report, and you see that RA prices are above $6 right now. So I'm just wondering whether it's reasonable for resources with market power to at least get the market price.
Yeah, I think the one comment, and I know I've sort of said this already, but I think what we're trying to do with this mechanism is to make sure that a resource that the ISO needs for reliability gets compensated such that it can stay around in the market over the period that we make the designation for. And we think that if there's competition, we don't have any problem with the CSP outcomes. If there's not competition, we're making a proposal here and we're saying, well, we can go ahead and give full cost of service because there have been concerns from stakeholders about the current price that's paid. I don't know that I want to comment on, including feedback from RA prices, which we may have limited visibility into.
And these didn't get an RA.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think John was just sort of saying over here to me that, these resources didn't get an RA contract, and it's not clear to us as the ISO why that was the case.
Does it matter, though? I mean, so you keep saying you are hearing feedback from stakeholders. I would say my feedback is I firmly believe that a resource, especially a resource with market power, especially one that is needed, is entitled to the market price. And I know there isn't that much visibility right now, but the CPUC is proposing a central buyer structure where we will have a lot more transparency and immediate transparency on the market price. And I would say it's definitely, given where RA prices are now and given that they're probably known through FERC EQR data, I would say that it is unjust and unreasonable to explicitly prevent a resource from getting the market price.
Okay. Thanks for the comment.
Other questions?
Sure. Please go ahead.
Hi, Gabe. This is Todd Ryan from PG&E again. Hey, I have a lot of questions. I will try to ask them in pieces and jump on and off so that other people can weigh in. But let's start with that diagram you have showing the process. And I'm hoping you could talk a little bit, explain quickly whether you're collecting cost of service data only when there are multiple resources, or are you collecting cost of service data after the structural test, the pivotal supplier test, yields a uncompetitive result?
Yeah, that's a great point. This is only when there's multiple resources that the ISO could use to meet the reliability need that we've identified in the system. If there's not multiple resources, we simply extend the full cost of service designation. That's right. Okay, so you still gotcha. Okay, now in the extent that, or the case that there's multiple resources, but the structural test yields an uncompetitive result, can you speak a little bit about how you may try to compare the bids of the pivotal and non-pivotal suppliers? Because it seems like you might be comparing apples and oranges in the CSP. You may have some bids that are based on, the factors you suggested, being going forward fixed cost, risk, market, expected market, et cetera. And for those that are pivotal, those would be effectively cost of service numbers. And so it seems like there might be you might need to spill a little more ink on terms of how you might compare those. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure I fully get your question, but I think so. Let me primarily, sure, okay. So let's assume that there's only one bidder and he's found to be pivotal, yep. But they bid at a competitive price. Now, what if there's three participants, yeah. And there's one that's pivotal, and they're all bidding at a competitive price? You know what I'm saying? There's the difference between structural and behavioral. Yeah, I think we're saying that we don't want to make a judgment about what the bids are, if the bids are competitive or not in the CSP. I think it's a fairly safe bet to say that, well, hey, if there really are 4 or 5 resource owners that are competing in the CSP, to get a designation, I think that's probably reasonable to say, yeah, there's probably going to be competitive bids in that construct, because hey, if I'm a resource owner, I'd sure want to get my resource a designation, whereas other resource, and I'm going to bid in competitively because of that, because I know that other resource owners are going to try to get themselves the designation as well. Of course, if there's like things like collusion or something in the market, that could beg other questions, and there might need to be more investigation into that if that did happen. But we're not really thinking about that problem today so much. Your other question is, well, what happens if, hey, that one guy does bid in competitively? And I think that brings up an interesting concern for us. And one of the things that I said early on in this presentation is that, hey, CPM designations today are relatively easy for the ISO to administer. We get the designations or we get the bids in the CSP. We know what those bids are. They directly translate over to a capacity payment, which is made through our settlement systems. Nothing changes with the way the resources bid into the market or the way BCR works or anything like that. So, yeah, if we got that competitive bid and we sort of say, okay, we're not going to take the competitive bid because there was only one resource, and obviously one resource would always fail the three-pivotal supplier test, does it make sense to go through the full process of full cost of service? And I think with this proposal, we're saying, well, the benefits to extending full cost of service may outweigh the extra burden that we have to take on from doing these designations. Does that help to answer your question a little bit?
I think so. I think it may be worth considering a little bit more, having just a little bit more thought in terms of potential scenarios where it may be beneficial to at least collect the cost of service data and use that to make some kind of unit-specific cap and then judge the bid versus that cap, or some mechanism by which you can make a behavioral assessment of the bid. But we can talk about that offline. Another question is
I do think that's an interesting idea, and there may be, as you might already anticipate, there may be some burden in coming up with what that cap is. But I think that's an interesting idea. Thank you.
On your question on partial designations versus full designations, tell me if I'm wrong, but it seems like there's an assumption that if a resource is being designated for an annual CPM, and it's pivotal, and so you're going through cost of service, that resource has no other mechanism to find contracts or sell that residual capacity to other people through other mechanisms.
That's exactly correct, and I think that's important if that didn't come through clearly. But when the ISO makes this full cost of service designation, it's very similar to an RMR. So those megawatts of capacity are designated through this full cost of service CPM contract, and they are required to bid that capacity into the ISO market. Now, it does come with full cost of service compensation, so they're compensated for all their costs. But yeah, they're fully designated and they can't earn revenues elsewhere.
But I guess my point is that if you were to partially designate for an annual, is there another process by which that resource could sell its residual capacity, say in the monthly or intra-monthly agents, or RA bilaterally?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a potential for that, but just because of the way the full cost of service works, you really can't break it out into partial designations, and that's sort of where we're at with that problem right now.
Thank you.
Yep. Thanks for the questions.
Any other questions, Lindy?
Just one more here.
Gabe, this is Stephen Kelly with IEP again, and I'd like to talk about framework and incentives a little bit. Currently, we have a framework where RMR and risk of retirement is obtained at the end of the whole cycle of procurement. And most RA is supposed to be procured in the forward markets under the jurisdiction of the PUC and so forth. And the CPM mechanism was a transition between those two tools. And it had the value of the potentially reflecting some value for scarcity.
Mm-hmm.
When I hear what you're proposing to do, you're proposing to suck into the CPM mechanism much of the RMR tools. And in doing that, it strikes me that you are obliterating the potential for scarcity pricing in the CPM, which created incentives for LSEs to procure RA in the forward market. And as a result of that, I think there's a risk of LSEs leaning on the ISO CPM mechanism. Could you address that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that's a valid concern, Stephen, and I appreciate you bringing that up. I think we've talked a little bit about it, but primarily the idea would be that yes, this is a flavor of CPM that looks a whole heck of a lot like an RMR designation, and we're using the compensation paradigm that we use for the RMR contracts, and it's going to be the same contracts. So yeah, I think you're right. This is going to be a very similar flavor to RMR. We're not completely throwing out the competitive solicitation process. We're still going to have that when there are multiple people participating in the markets in the competitive solicitation process, or sufficient capacity available in the CSP. Further, we're still going to have the CSP for monthly designations and intra-monthly designations, so we're not completely getting rid of the CPM paradigm. Now, I do agree that this does change things a little bit in the annual paradigm, particularly, and then this is something Carrie pointed out, the annual paradigm for local designations. Local designations are likely not going to be competitive, or at least they're generally not competitive now, which is just sort of why we have a lot of the local areas that we have set up in the market. So, I think, partly we're not completely getting rid of the CSP paradigm, and we're keeping a large amount of it in place, and hopefully that does send those same sort of signals. But on the other hand, if we do have these designations and they do turn out to be large dollar amounts, and some of these resources may be fully depreciated and may have going forward fixed costs significantly lower than the soft offer cap, I think we're kind of the opinion that it does make sense to extend something that looks like cost of service to reflect those costs, rather than something that maybe is that soft offer cap reflecting for fixed costs for a newer resource. And I think that's sort of where we're at with that.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of evidence apparently that suggests that in the foreseeable future, local RA and probably system RA, and I would suspect flexible RA, are going to be relatively tight for the next 5 to 10 years. And one tool to create incentives for additional resources was the fact that the CPM had a semblance of scarcity valuation in it. And I think you're removing that. I think you're going to create you're proposing a situation that obliterates that market signal.
Yeah. Okay. We'll continue to think about that, Stephen. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions, Wendy?
As of now, we do have a few more here. I apologize. We've taken all the questions right now.
Okay, great. So the last part of this policy initiative is just discussing the changes that we have proposed in the RMR CPM Enhancement Initiative for bids above the soft offer cap. And this is something that, of course, we put through the stakeholder process It was approved by our Board of Governors in March of this year, but it was not included in the filing at FERC with the remainder of that, the changes that were included in that policy initiative. The changes here outlined, and again, this was approved in the policy, outlined what would happen to bids above the soft offer cap. So currently, bids above the soft offer cap can reflect full cost of service and resources that are designated at bids above the soft offer cap are eligible to receive market revenues. But the proposal in the RMR CPM Enhancements Initiative was to change that to reflect bids above the soft offer cap only being going forward fixed costs plus market revenues. We also proposed that when we filed this, we would file this option, and we would also file an alternate option, and FERC could sort of weigh in on the validity of both of these. But the alternate option would be simply going forward fixed costs without the 20% adder plus market revenues as the compensation that would be available for resources that are bidding above the soft offer cap. Clearly, the 20% adder reflects how we're currently calculating and computing the soft offer cap today, which as we've discussed, sort of was in line with original FERC requirements. And then not including the 20% would be more reflective of just simply, what are the going forward fixed costs for this specific resource, because it is a specific resource and not a general resource that's used to submit the soft offer cap. As I mentioned, this language has not been filed at FERC yet, but will be included in the CPM soft offer cap initiative filing, and that's our intention. And then the changes proposed in this initiative that we've talked about through the prior two sections don't really indicate a need to change this piece of the initiative that's sort of already been discussed in a prior initiative. So we're not planning to spend a whole lot more time sort of discussing that here. And then it's also worth noting the final bullet on this page is that the ISO really hasn't ever made a CPM designation to resources above the soft cap, so it may not be terribly pressing that we get this in place. I think it is important that we get the CPM mechanism squared away and make sure that all of the aspects of this initiative are trued up, and reflecting these changes in the CPM paradigm is important for that goal, but it's not necessarily required necessarily immediately. So with that, that's everything that I had on our proposal. So I think we can take one more round of questions if there are any on the phone, and then I'll turn it back over to Christina to wrap up.
Sure, absolutely. We do have one here.
Sure, go ahead.
Hey, Gabe, this is Eric. Sorry, I don't know exactly what happened. I was trying to actually comment on the last section, so sorry to take you backwards a little bit. But first of all, support what the ISO is doing here. Second of all, to comments that were made about being able to look at the RA prices from the from PUC's RA report, I will note that I am hesitant to do so because it's not perfect information. It's not a one-for-one relationship. We don't know what product exactly was purchased, and I don't think you can compare the highest priced ever that they have in that report to what the market is bearing. We don't know what the term was, don't know how many months or month was included, et cetera. But just one question for you on your proposal. When you do the 3 pivotal supplier test, can you clarify exactly what is eligible to be included in the list of competitive entities? I assume that it's going to be only resources that are capable of meeting the need. So if it's a local area, it would be a resource in the local area. It's only resources that do not presently have an RA agreement, do not have a CPM agreement, and are not listed and are not an RMR as well. So, sorry, I'm not sure if I said that right. They're not shown as RA, they're not a CPM, and they're not RMR, and they do have the attributes to meet the need that the ISO has identified. Is that what's going to be listed as the eligible set of resources for the 3 pivotal supplier?
That's exactly right, Eric. I couldn't have said it better myself.
Eric, are you talking about the entire resource being RA or CPM? I mean, what if you have a partial RA resource or a partial CPM resource?
No, if it's partial, that's fine, because that other portion, I think, is eligible to be a CPM at that point. So I don't have a problem with that, but it would only be for the quantity that it has available to it as a partial. So if it was a 100 megawatt resource and it had sold 50 megawatts as RA, it would only be 50 megawatts from that resource aggregated up to that supplier that would be included within the 3 pivotal supplier, if I'm understanding you correctly.
Yeah, that's what we've anticipated, Eric.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yep, for sure.
Any other questions, Wendy?
Sure, we have a couple more.
Hey, Gabe, it's Mark Smith. First of all, thanks for this meeting. I was trying to get through earlier. I'm going to ask a couple of questions. One following up on Todd's issues. And then a comment on item 2 and item 3 and the relationship between those two. So first, I mean, Todd raised some interesting questions about the comparisons that you're going to do. Let's take a circumstance where you have the CSP, you have multiple bids, they're all below 631, and yet you fail the 3 pivotal supplier test. Is your proposal that in that case that you would evaluate the full cost of service of all of those pivotal suppliers, and even though they had bid competitively below 331 or 631, and pay them only their full cost of service on a cost minimization with the cost minimization objective?
Yeah, as we've outlined the proposal right now, that is what we would be looking at. So we'd first determine if there are multiple resources, then we go through and do the 3 pivotal supplier test. But if it didn't pass the 3 pivotal supplier test, we would go through and solicit cost of service data from those resources, and then from that information that we receive, we would make our full cost of service CPM designation based on that information to the least cost resources, and then hopefully that would satisfy our RA need.
Okay. We'll put this in comments, but it may be best for you to reconsider and pay the maximum of bid in that market or the full cost of service. Let me look at the other version of that, where cost of service is substantially above 631. So I guess your proposal is that if there is market power and an entity has a full cost of service of $9 a kilowatt month, that you would do that analysis. If it fails, you would pay the $9. That's right, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Good. I just wanted to clarify those two things. Now, I just want to follow up on item 2 and item 3. You indicated that, you've already considered item 3, which is what bids above the cost of service, or bids above the soft cap have to be based on. But you've changed item 2, which is, the real potential that units in pivotal position could end up being paid their full cost of service above the 631. It seems to me that change to item 2 has to be married to or coordinated with item 3. In other words, there may be circumstances where a resource is willing to bid above 631 but not up to its full cost of service, or not, its entire full cost of service, and that would benefit the system. So it seems to me that we'll put this in comments, but that you want to coordinate bidding with the potential that somebody could be paid full cost of service.
Yeah, I understand the issue that you're outlining there. That's interesting. I'll have to think about that.
So we'll put in comments that make that clear. I just want to say that especially for resources who have costs above the 631, I think Calpine has long supported the fact that where there is market power, there is no market solution, and I think regulation requires you to pay a regulated return for those resources. So we'll support that as well in our comments.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Next question, Lindy.
Sure.
Hey, Gabe, it's Todd Ryan again from PG&E. There's been a couple questions or comments about the level of competition in local and system, and I'm wondering if CAISO plans to kind of publish any kind of data to kind of give us a feeling for the level of competition, because I think that might, I think stakeholders may have differing opinions on the level of competition.
Yeah, maybe I could follow up with you offline about that request.
Okay. Can you make a general, you seem to have made a statement earlier that a lot of local solicitations have not been competitive. Can you speak to whether annual versus monthly, if there's any difference in competition you're seeing?
Yeah, I think I'd like to kind of go back and review some of the data. I know that the ISO does have several publications that it puts out on local areas. We don't have any experts in the room on that at the moment, but we can look into that data and sort of follow back up with you on those specific questions. But I don't have that data in front of me, and I don't want to misstate something.
Fair. Just to make my thoughts explicit, we really appreciate the direction you're heading in, and we think there's a lot of really positive steps forward here, and really, just willing to work with you on the details. I do have concerns about if structurally there is uncompetitive, let's say in local, that monthly versus annual doesn't make a difference, and by not extending the pivotal supplier test, at least in terms of a indicator, just collecting the data and understanding for further future policy initiatives, whether or not local monthly solicitations are competitive or not, is just turning a blind eye to competition. That's my personal opinion.
Yeah, thank you for that comment, Todd. Appreciate it.
Any other questions?
One more.
Caller, your line may be muted on your end.
Yes, you're right. Sorry, this is Michelle Cheeto from the CPUC. Sorry about that. So I just wanted to say for the annual solicitations, I think we wrote about this in our comments, that the two annual designations were not competitive. The one was Encina, and there was no other resource in the San Diego IIP area that could meet it. In addition, the other annual solicitation was Moss Landing, and it's my understanding that there was no other resource in the Bay Area that could meet it, so I just wanted to add that. And then I also wanted to talk a little bit about the 20% and get your thoughts about why you include the 20% if the study itself includes fixed O&M.
Yeah, I think you're thinking about bids above the soft offer cap. Is that right?
No, I'm talking about the fact that the current CPM includes the CEC cost plus the 20% adder. That's how it was determined last time.
Okay.
I'm asking you why you would include the 20%.
Order that said going forward cost.
Could you not interrupt me, please?
Inadequate.
So I would like to be able to finish my. Sorry. So as I was saying, the way that it was structured the last time was it was based on the CEC study, and it was plus a 20% adder for constructions that you wanted to be able to include some fixed cost recovery. So I'm just asking why you would do the study again with the 20% adder. If the study, which we've looked into, includes fixed O&M already, and also there's a possibility for market rents. which cover fixed costs as well. So why would you include the 20% adder going forward? I understand that Anthony's probably going to say this is the way it was done last time, but you guys are deviating from the structure that was used last time, which is using the CEC study. So I'm just asking you to look and try to understand why you would include that 20% adder.
Last time we used the CEC study plus a 20% adder. Fixed O&M in the CEC study is not the same as a 20% adder. Fixed O&M is like standard maintenance costs and operational costs. The 20% adder is for things like capital upgrades, major maintenance, environmental type upgrades, and things like that. So they're not,
Anthony?
the fixed O&M is not the same as a 20% adder.
So Anthony, what if I said major maintenance is included? So are you saying major maintenance is different than capital addition?
The CEC study covers standard maintenance. It doesn't cover any type of capital addition or those types of items.
Are you certain of that?
Yeah, because going forward, fixed cost does not include any type of capital investment or taxes, except for ad valorem.
Okay, so here's my other question. But if you keep market rents, why is that not your opportunity to cover those?
Well, they also, market rents has also got to recover a return on investment. In addition, and plus any sunk capital costs you may already have, in addition to whatever sort of environmental or other type of upgrades you might need.
So Anthony, what if you're a fully retired 60-year-old unit, fully depreciated?
Well, that fully depreciated unit may be at a point where it needs to undertake capital upgrades or other investments because it's old and run down.
Okay,
also,
I'm just saying.
It's also going to want to earn some modicum of a return to want to stay in business.
Okay, I'm just saying under the current paradigm, it includes fixed O&M, which includes major maintenance, which includes like every 5 years, every 10 years that you need to make additions to the resource. It also includes the 20% adder. Excuse me. That's the second time you've interrupted me. I'd really appreciate it if I could speak. It also includes, it includes fixed O&M, it includes the 20% adder, and it also includes return of market rents. And I feel like we're like double dipping here if you include all of those, and possibly triple dipping.
So Michelle, it sounds like you've got some concerns about the fundamental way that the soft offer cap is initially set up, and the way that we're thinking about the soft offer cap right now. So maybe we could have a follow-up conversation offline, or maybe if we had some, it sounds like you have quite a number of concerns. So maybe if you were able to provide us like a written version of these concerns, we could sort of step through each of them in turn, and perhaps address them in the next version of the paper.
Most of them were included in our filing, the RMR CPM filing, so we did talk about this, but given that the CEC study came out and largely confirmed that it does include the 20% adder and the prices are going down, it does seem like that it's not entirely justified. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks a lot.
Okay. But thank you for your comments. We do appreciate those.
Any other questions or comments?
None as of now.
All right, let's go on to the next step. So we are asking for stakeholders to submit comments on the straw proposal and the discussion today. Those are going to be due August 20th. You could send those to the initiative comments mailbox. We did post a template out there We're asking for comments on our proposal to maintain the CPM soft offer cap as well as the changes to the 12-month CPM designation and any additional comments that you have on the elements proposed. So again, those are due August 20th, and then we're targeting, depending on the comments we receive, to put out the next iteration of the paper on sometime in September, followed by a stakeholder call. So are there any other questions or comments at this time? No questions?
No questions as of now.
Great, thank you. So again, we did record the meeting today. We are going to make that recording available out on the initial webpage. Look for that probably by the end of this week. So thank you, everyone, for your participation, and thank you, operator. We're going to disconnect now.
Thank you for joining the conference today. The call has now concluded, and you may disconnect. And thank you for using AT&T Event Conferencing Enhanced.